And again, I don't need to lock up each side because you will be putting a binding on that side. So we're going across. We'll stop, we lift, and again, like I said, always lift in there and make sure it's loose. Now I'm switching it to 5 stitch for basting. When you're just doing one mask, time doesn't matter, but when you have a pile of 20 sitting in front of you, it's nice to make it go as quick as possible. So now I'm back down to regular top stitch because this is what people will see. Right back up. And okay, so now the fun part comes. We're going to cut those. So now we make the pleats. Okay, so we are going to turn it again. The good side goes to the table. The back side is up front. You're going to grab 2 sides. Notice my fingers. You're going to be making 3 pleats in an adult size. If this were a child size, you would make only 2 pleats. So another piece of advice I will give you is start small at the bottom, because even though it feels like there's a lot of space, I've also in the beginning found that I would start too big like this, and by the time I got up there wasn't room for a 3rd pleat, so I had to take it apart and start over again. So just a little piece of advice, start smaller at the bottom. So I'm like about a finger width is what I'm looking at, and I'm just going to fold it, and now I'm going to hold with my fingers and grab my pins, which I also find very handy to just leave them sitting on my tabletop, because then I can just grab. All right, that's number 1. Now we go to number 2. I tend to go a little bit bigger on the second one. People have the option of whether or not they want to open up the bottom one. When I wear them, I don't actually always open the bottom one. I don't feel that I need it. So here's seam pleat number 2. Okay. Now here's where I always use pins. Obviously, it would be impossible to do this and sew without the pins. Now when I get to the last one, I don't do it together. I go from one side to the other. So, because what you want is you don't want the pleats overlapping each other. So when I get to the top, I use what's left. Oh, and I bring the pleat to this seam, the middle seam. You have your top seam, and then you have that edge right at the actual seam where the opening is. That's where I bring the top pleat. So I go, takes a little time sometimes to find the right width, and that looks pretty good. See how that worked out? So I'm going to pin that one. Go ahead, okay, and then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So what I'm saying is sometimes, depending on how you're stitching, one side might be a little bit more narrow than the other side. In this scheme of things, when this is all said and done, it won't matter as long as it's not a really big difference. That's why this last one I find I do each side differently, because sometimes one side's a little thicker than the other. No one will ever notice, it's fine. Okay, so now we go back again to the ironing board, and we're just going to set them. So we're just going to make sure they're all folded nice, and then we get the iron, and we're just going to give it a good press. And what do you see? Now it's starting to look like a mask. There you go. Again, press it real nice. Okay, so now once again, we go back to the sewing machine. So I take it, turn it upside down. The bottom side of I start with the bottom side on the right. Bring this in. We're still at basting stitch. You do not need to use a big stitch, a tight stitch for this one. Now here's another piece of advice when you're stitching this up. If you don't, as the feeds, the teeth are taking the fabric in, make sure you're pushing each pleat in toward the foot, because if you don't, what happens is it will tend to sort of stretch out and separate. So you're going to want to definitely just hold on. You're going to pull one pin out at a time. I always do. I'm always afraid my needle will break. So see how I'm pushing it? I'm keeping them, so I'm going slow here purposely, but I'm really pressing so that they stay close together. You don't want them to open up. And then we'll go to the other side, same exact thing. And again, I do this from the back side because that's where we did the pleating. So you have your access to your pins. If you find it curls up, sometimes I'll lift the foot and just bring that. Even sometimes I've used just to show you, if you see it's folding over, because it does happen sometimes, just grab a scissor and just go in there and press it down. And done. Okay. So now this thing is ready for the binding. Always trim all the threads. Okay, so now you're going to make the binding. You will get the cuts. So you'll have these all cut for you. But we want the binding to match the fabric. So we don't use the binding that you buy in the fabric store. We make it. So this thing is about 2.5 inches wide. You're going to get them various lengths. I always cut these out of scraps of fabric, so you never know how long of a fabric it'll be, but you'll be able to cut down as you need. So you're just going to fold over, not quite